Hello, and you're listening to a free preview of the Pulse Check podcast by Quwa. Hi, Aseem. How are you?
Good, how are you?
I'm doing well. So, for this episode, I decided, we'll change gears a little bit and start our discussion on Turkey. Obviously, we will pivot towards Pakistan because this is this whole show is in relation on the structural sides of Pakistan's decision making in national security and defense and what have you. But the the thesis that I have for you this week, it stemmed from a lot of conversations I've seen as of late online, as well as in the past 10 years or so since we saw the rise of Turkey's defense industry out in, at a global level. And I thought it would be interesting to sort of unpack all this from this perspective of someone who is, an actual engineer who's worked within the defense industry, who obviously has, real experience working in the actual field, to get a sense from you of basically, the fundamental question is like Turkey's defense industry, are its advancements real or are they hype? And from there, we can sort of unpack the implications and what Turkey would need to do and how Pakistan could basically collaborate and also build its own positioning, and how we would juxtapose this stuff with, let's say, what's happening with China and what have you. So, I'll just get into the thesis and then we can take it from there. Turkey's defense industry advancements, in my opinion, my assessment, they're real, they're genuine. They're anchored in actual R&D investment and a growing industrial base. Turkey is a newly industrialized country. That's the categorization. It's part of, I believe, the OECD. It's part of the G20. So, you don't get to these, I guess, clubs, or you don't get these classifications if you don't have a somewhat of some level of industrial scalability and R&D competency and what have you. So I think all that and all those products that we see every year, whether it's at the recent Saha or the IDEF and all that, I think all those are absolutely genuine. They are real products. They're not vaporware. I don't think there's any hype or exaggeration within the products in of themselves, but there are some caveats, and the caveats are basically that the long-term sustainability of these various projects and the defense industry as a whole is contingent on Turkey's ability to scale for orders, scale or to distribute the overhead that they're basically accumulating across all of this R&D, to essentially go from the red on however many of these projects into the black, basically, so they can start recouping their investments. So, and the caveat here is that Turkey cannot generate all that scale alone. I mean, if you think about it, when it comes to a country with an end-to-end defense industry that covers every single aspect of their requirements, you really just have two and a half examples. So the singular examples are the US and China. Both of them are able to scale immensely. The US maintains a global military architecture, basically a presence all over the world. It has to sustain that, as through its alliances and partnerships, it has many customers for its wares. China is basically trying to essentially fortify and defend against that architecture within Asia. So as you can imagine, to basically match that capability, even just within the Pacific, you have to build up quite a bit of capability. So there's a massive domestic order base, even if the exports are not as strong, aside from, let's say, Pakistan, basically. And then you have, I would call them the 0.5 examples. So there are countries that have at one point been able to cover their needs end to end. Those are like France and Russia. But because of the reality of the way these military technologies have advanced over the years, and the fact is that there's so many dependencies in like rare earths and critical technologies and what have you, that they themselves rely on either some form of Western consortium, like in the case of France with the Europeans, or in the case of the Russians, increasingly on China. So you have them, and then everybody else is sort of in the middle. And there could be a South Korea, there could be a Turkey, but you notice that either in the case of South Korea, you really depend on both a strong domestic order base as well as massive partnerships and exports. South Korea has been doing pretty well on that front in terms of generating exports within the NATO field, especially as the European wares, American wares have become more costlier. And with that, Turkey, if the belief is that they'll be able to sustain these projects on their own independently, then the economics just don't line up, and that would actually be the real threat to these programs. It's not so much that they have an R&D and knowledge issue, rather in the pros of Chat GPT, they have a scale issue basically. And I think this is where, for countries like Pakistan, but many others as well, like you can include Bangladesh, you can include Saudi Arabia, you can include Egypt, you can include many countries, Indonesia, Malaysia, what have you, that if you're able to all pool together your markets and your demands, then you're able to generate that scale. And through consortium building, you can start collectively as a group, start taking collective ownership of those critical technologies, critical supply chains, and what have you, and sort of be like a modulator in the center between the East and the West, basically, because you have on both ends, in Turkey, you have pre-existing relationships with the West. A lot of that R&D culture has moved in. In Pakistan, you can argue more on the eastern side with some Western influence, and then on the Indonesia, Malaysia side, maybe now it is more Western. But the point being is that you have so much already there in terms of experience, people, expertise, markets, demand, fiscal capacity, but it has to be done as a group. And that's a lesson you would take away from, let's say, a European Union, for example, or even the Asia Pacific with South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, potentially looking to get closer as well, or definitely between South Korea and Australia, for example. So I think, that's my thesis, is that the products are real. And I mean, definitely compared to Pakistan, Turkey is in a much better position to scale out and produce these products that they have. But while they're able to bring it to production, they are going to be higher cost, relatively speaking. They're not going to be competitive from a pricing standpoint with the Chinese because the scale just isn't there. Like the R&D overhead has to get recouped because many of these defense programs are funded by either the private sector in Turkey, or they are essentially funded by, yes, the state-owned enterprises like Turkish Aerospace Industries or Turkish Aerospace or TUSAS, what have you. But the problem is that, or the challenge is that these entities are not like money pits. They are also they have KPI. They are profit and loss measured because they're funded by a pensions fund. And then the Turkish Armed Forces Pension Fund wants to make sure the pensions are healthy, so they need a positive return on investment. So even though these are state-owned enterprises similar to, let's say, NESCOM, they're not money pits. You just can't put money into them for the sake of national security. There is some level of business here that has to be maintained. And because of that, the outcome is that I think a good example was that, for example, the T-129 deal that Pakistan signed. Yeah, it got squashed by the Americans, but it was like 30 helicopters for around $1.5 billion. I believe it is, it must have included some offsets and MRO and all that kind of stuff. But the unit price was not too far off from the AH-1Z Viper, right? Which was also 50 million, but it was a bigger helicopter, arguably higher quality in many respects, more durable, could operate in some of the roughest, toughest environments, battle proven, but the unit prices were almost the same, right? Between the heavy and light. So, I mean, that's like an indication that the Turkish stuff, maybe not, definitely not as expensive as the French or the British, but not as cost effective and attractive as the Chinese stuff. And that's, again, I think a scale issue. And that's the issue that's going to need to be solved for Turkey's defense industry to take the next step. And I think that is where they're facing a lot of challenges. And it's not just a Pakistan thing. I think it's like, even within the Gulf, you would imagine they might have seen more progress, but there's something that seems to be stopping them. And I would love to see and get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so because we are a Pakistani podcast and we are Pakistanis looking at this from a Pakistani perspective, I will say something that I was discussing with you offline as well. And that will sort of put into perspective what all the things that I'm going to say. And I sort of feel that it makes those things make sense more. And here's that statement. That statement is, Turkey is kind of like Pakistan. If Pakistan had like 30, 40 years to develop the way we want it to develop, right? If Pakistan become a developed or developing country, like much more developed than it is, it would have become into Turkey. And what I mean by that, it's going to become clearer as I talk about this more. But what I mean is, yes, they have a lot of access to a lot of things. They have technologies, they have industrialized, as you have pointed out, but then there are tiny things that you'll see. Maybe they're cultural, that make them, do things that are not, entirely Western either. Sometimes they do things that are, Eastern culture. They're like, yes, geographically they're in the, in the center of the West and the East, but that's where they are culturally as well. And that'll become, hopefully obvious by the end of this episode. regarding what you've said, about your general thesis, I mostly agree with that. Like you've said, Turkey has had multiple decades of experience being integrated into the Western aerospace and industrial, infrastructure. I cannot understate the value of being able to do that. And again, I will contrast that with Pakistan, right? So I'll give you a completely made up, really simple example. Let's say you wanted to import like a certain kind of carbon fiber like input, like a carbon fiber sheet. If you're in Turkey, you can just go and buy that and import that from Germany or somewhere, and that'll come to your door in a couple of days, right? Or maybe 10 days. If you want to do the same thing in Pakistan, maybe that material is not even on a export control list somewhere. But as soon as someone sees the word Pakistan, they're like, no, we're not going to do business with you. Right. So there's like a reputation thing, and there's like a integrated into the Western infrastructure thing that prevents like tons of things that are not available in Pakistan that are available Turkey. So that's one thing, right? So that is a great opportunity for them. So that allows them to do tons of things, right? So they have access to inputs that Pakistan does not have, right? So that's one of the things that differentiates between the two. The other is the level of industrialization that they have, right? So it's all over the news, right? So that Turkey's inflation has been a problem for decades at this point, right? So they had hyperinflation in the 2000s, right? And now they're having it again. And people like to claim, oh, Pakistan's inflation isn't as bad as Turkey's. But you're not looking. So the reason just looking at the inflation numbers is kind of misleading here, because Turkey actually has an industrial economy to back, whatever is happening with their currency. Pakistan does not, right? Pakistan is basically controlling that inflation by shutting down its economy in a way. So there shouldn't be like praise that, Turkey's having so much inflation, so we're actually doing better. Not really. Your inflation is not a good metric for how industrialized or how developed your country really is, right? So I just wanted to get that out of the way. So they've took like a very reasonable approach to R&D in aerospace, by which I mean they've been very gradual. They didn't start off with TFX, as I've said on multiple podcasts and articles before. They started doing like F-16 overhauls and manufactured parts for the F-16. Then they went to the Hurjet. Then they went to in parallel, they were doing helicopters. They were doing UAVs. Then they went to the TFX, right? There's actually like thousands of people from Hurjet that are now working in the TFX program. They're directly leveraging that workforce, right? So that should tell you the value of, having these precursor programs. And that's something very smart that Turkey has done that, we haven't done. And we straight up went ahead to Azam or PFX now. Anyway, the other thing is about exports and scale that you mentioned. So I do believe they're acutely aware of this. So I know for a fact that Turkish Aerospace, it has export goals every year, and they try to export as much as they can. So they actually have numbers, and they're actually trying to compete with international players. As they're trying to. So their benchmarks are Boeing and Lockheed Martin and places like these, right? So obviously they don't export anywhere near those companies, but they're they know that that's their goal. That's the goal that they're striving for. So they're very, they know that this is an issue that they need to address. How good they are at addressing this issue, I don't know. But the way you know that they're actually serious about this is look at the number of offices Turkish Aerospace has across the world. They are, you could argue that they're there for R&D. They're trying to leverage workforce from the rest of the world. Maybe that's part of the problem. That's part of the reason. But it's primarily because I think they're trying to set up roots in countries where they eventually want to export things. Like, so for example, they have a Turkish Aerospace Pakistan, they have a Turkish Aerospace Malaysia, they have a Turkish Aerospace Indonesia, Turkish Aerospace Saudi Arabia. And you'll notice all these countries are potential export customers for the TFX. Right. So they are trying to build that scale. I don't know if they'll ever get to the scale of, the Americans or the Chinese, but, they are trying to do this. Yeah.
So, in relation to, for example, I think, with Turkish Aerospace Pakistan, and maybe this might be, this might extend into the other, let's say, Turkish Aerospace children, so to speak. I think the perception, and at least within Pakistan, has been somewhat, as you kind of alluded to, a bit erroneous in regards to the Turkish industry. So, for example, I remember, and you might remember this, like 10 years back when I started Quwa, I was probably one of the most foremost voices of, collaborating with Turkey, because I had the opportunity to be able to just find those Turkish language, at the time, defense news publications. There weren't many English ones at the time. And I just like run through them with a crude Google Translate. And I was starting to see that, hey, there's a lot of stuff happening in Turkey, right? Like, they're not just repackaging Western solutions. Like, for example, I think with the Hisar program, I remember writing about it, which is their Roketsan's surface-to-air missile platform. And I remember writing about it initially, and I got like a lot of feedback from primarily Indian commentators and readers. And it's not to insult them or anything, but I think it's just an interesting juxtaposition of how people perceive Turkey. Was that, they said that, hey, this looks like a repackaged CAM or Aster missile. And if you look at it visually, you're like, okay, I don't know where we're seeing the similarities, but okay. But when you start going into the Turkish language interviews, and especially in, I think the magazine at the time that I was looking at was MSI. They were like the foremost publication. They probably still are. They used to interview a lot of these officials. And you understood that, hey, like this surface-to-air missile program that they have, the Hisar, is actually backed by deep indigenous work that has been going on since like the 2000s. They have been pioneering their own, dual pulse motor rocket stack, and they've been doing a lot of research into solid fuel compositions on the chemical side. And all that has basically started to compound a bit. So it compounded enough in the mid 2010s to produce a short to medium range SAM system. Now it's compounding to a more intense degree, like a very rapid degree now, because, we're not talking now 10 years. It's been 10 years since I started talking about this stuff. So the compounding effect has grown even more, that now they're, basically delving into, or they're mass producing rather, short to medium range ballistic missiles of their own. And in all this, the conversations, in all these conversations, the repeated sense that I got, and this is going on from like 2016 until maybe 2023, 2024. So it's, maybe it ended quite recently. But the sense was, and I think you remember this as well, is people were saying that no, Turkey is all American, all their industry stuff is just repackaging Western goods, just do transfer of technology. I remember there was this particular person on the forum that you remember saying this. Once you got the opportunity to like see more of how both Pakistan and Turkey actually operate, I'm sure you noticed this as well, that no, this stuff is real, and there's a huge difference between what Turkey's been doing and what Pakistan has, let's say, has been telling people it's been doing. And once that exposure happened,
let me just, cut you off and,
Yeah.
jump off what you said.
Yeah.
And let me emphasize the difference that, access to technology makes, right? So Pakistan, like, for example, says it's going to make the Azam. Like, that's the perfect juxtaposition of differences with Azam and TFX, right? Pakistan says it's going to make this 5th generation fighter program. But you have to look at what Pakistan has done before this. Not much, right? JF-17 was primarily, I know this is an unpopular opinion for people on the internet, it's primarily developed by China, right? You don't have any qualification or, design infrastructure inside Pakistan, right? It's all in Chengdu. Anyway, but look at what Turkey did, right? So they started in the 80s with 90s with the F-16, right? They had this progression that I just talked about, right? They had thousands of people. They have an industrialized economy. They have industries that can make aluminum, steel, composites, like all these things that have taken decades of investment and, years of investment, decades of investment and, has thousands of people with, international collaboration. So Turkish Aerospace has, contracts with Airbus. It has very deep connections with Airbus and it actually makes parts for their airliners, right? Entire fuselage parts. It makes entire fuselage parts for the A-freight. So these are like things that teach you so many things about how to do things professionally, how the world's leaders in aerospace are doing something. You learn all these things, and then you are able to apply all these lessons to whatever you're doing, like let's say TFX. But where's that experience in Pakistan, right? What company did Pakistan collaborate with? Or, yeah.
And just to sort of build off what you just said there, I think it's a little bit of a tragedy within Pakistan because on the nuclear side, everything was done correctly. To be clear, Pakistan's nuclear program, as a result of the nuclear weapons program, did get, I don't want to say stunted, but I would say blunted. So not stunted, but blunted. And what I mean by that is that Pakistan had to make a very conscious trade-off in the late 60s, early 70s, between pursuing a nuclear weapon against the US sanctions regime, which was trying to stop it, or continuing with the civilian-led nuclear R&D, which was advancing quite a bit within Pakistan at the time, and having continued access to all the civilian technologies and what have you, and maybe even the military technologies to do the dual use stuff. But it had to make that decision because there's an existential threat. And that was a conscious trade-off, which they understood. And from there, they went into the nuclear weapons side. But even within the nuclear weapons side, they executed super competently. Let me put it this way. I don't want to say brilliant because, there was like a lot of things that went right throughout the process, but they were super competent in their execution. And it was a R&D civilian-led process at both ends, the plutonium and the uranium.
I think the
And
key there was they understood their capabilities and the
yeah,
realities. They weren't delusional. Excuse that word. That's entirely it. They were realistic. They knew what they were doing. They knew their capabilities. And that's what made them successful. And that's kind of what Turkey has had done as well.
exactly. With that, there was a foundation, as you noted, was that, before they went into nuclear weapons and basically before they even went and pursued the entire nuclear fuel cycle, they had the prior organic R&D foundation within nuclear that allowed them to pursue that. The infrastructure was there, as you noted. There was not just the scientific infrastructure, there was an industrial infrastructure. It was interesting was that at the time in the 60s and 70s, when they were when they were constructing the civilian nuclear reactors, the companies that were brought in, like I think it was like, for example, Canup, the Canadian ones, they were contracting out to Pakistani industrialists to help with the program. So that's where you had companies like Descon and others who built competency in reactor related implementations. Right. So there's a whole industry ecosystem. And obviously that ecosystem still exists because even now when the Chinese set up their, reactors, within Pakistan, they're still leveraging all of this prior infrastructure and capacity, which allows Pakistan to sort of absorb these reactors relatively seamlessly. Now, the blunting part is that our own reactor technology is not able to scale, even though we have designs and people who know how to get into things like small modular reactors and what have you, because we don't have access to free-flowing uranium. Right. So we cannot produce these reactors at scale and test them out and distribute them in every rural area and then, build an entire ecosystem of, editing, basically, making sure they work and support it. We don't have that, unfortunately, because that was a trade-off we made. But that being said, with the Turks, I think that's a similar foundation. They, number one, I think this is the most crucial point, is that they offloaded the fighter support and manufacturing to a actual separate state-owned entity, which is Turkish Aerospace. And the engine stuff to TEI, Tusas Engine Industries. These guys were basically run by the actual industry professionals. So you would have, instead of an officer, an air marshal, air vice marshal rotating in every 3, 4, or 5 years, you had people who were there for 10, 15, 20 years running the show because, and building that, I guess, institutional maturity and memory, building those connections and networks and maintaining them for very long periods of time within this industry. So I imagine the persons, run Tusas or Turkish Aerospace for building a lot of rapport and connections with people like in Airbus and Boeing and wherever else to be able to build those industry relationships and get those offset agreements going and start re-exporting goods, basically. And basically that allowed, within Turkish Aerospace, I imagine, for the people, the managers there to start basically organizing the facilities in a way where they're thinking about profit and loss. Obviously, their incentives were structured around that. It wasn't a money pit. They had to, provide positive earnings and reports so that the Armed Forces Pension Fund can basically continue growing and supporting the retired officers and soldiers. So it was under this backdrop that they had to sort of develop. And it was basically, in addition to the infrastructure, in addition to the prior experience, you had I guess, culture and the organization already there to start pursuing it forward. Whereas in the case of Pakistan with the JF-17, it was like basically, and it was a valid decision, but there are trade-offs, was that you had a fighting force that needed a multi-role fighter. It needed it pretty quick. It wasn't going to go through the whole process that India went through in order to develop the Tejas. And you saw, and we all see, that there's a lot of things that have to constantly be ironed out because of going at it alone. And they're very vocal about what's happening there. But those are the trade-offs you have to go through to eventually get to the point where you then have, in India's case, the entire R&D infrastructure to pursue, very advanced programs, right? Within scramjets, ramjets, ICBMs, obviously these are different subfields, but then even the EMCA program that I'm sure they themselves, or they know they can design it and develop it. But the point being is that that's one path, and the PAF needed to take the other path, which was to get an expedited fighter. So they basically offloaded the R&D to China. The unfortunate reality in all this is that the R&D knowledge and expertise was not transferred back to Pakistan. Instead, what really happened was that we sort of subsidized Chengdu's ability to develop its own R&D. We paid for half of the JF-17 program. So we paid, we basically paid Chengdu to go improve its R&D, which could then reapply into things like J10 and J20 and what have you. Obviously, just to be clear, 95% of the investment and work was from China and all these things. But my point I'm making is that investment money did not flow back to Pakistan, right? And now we're seeing the cost of it. And it just requires a major rethink in order to get to the level Turkey has. And then to your point, it certainly helps to have access to Western markets for critical inputs. I think in the case of Turkey and even India, to be clear, let's not undervalue this, but there are very few companies in the world that can provide cutting edge instrumentation, CNCs, testing, facility testing systems for wind tunnels, especially supersonic, hypersonic ones. And they're all controlled by like a handful of Western, primarily American or American co-invested players. And if you are not in the club, or worse, if you have like a bad label on you, like in the case of Pakistan, you just can't access this stuff, right? It's just impossible. So even when you do have the people, you're always going to be delayed by a number of years compared to your rivals or your allies in producing the cutting edge stuff, because you just don't have access to the things you need in order to do it. So there's that element as well, to your point. So all these things are sort of en masse contributed to Pakistan in its current situation, inversely or conversely contributed to Turkey in reaching its situation. But now where I want to steer the discussion is now, how can we bring these, we see the realities, how can we affect change within this? Like, what are some of the policies that you would personally pursue or look at in order to, at one level, let's say, scale out Turkey's solutions and get them to the level of being commonly seen everywhere in the world? And on Pakistan's end, fundamentally, it's really about fixing the Pakistani economy at a very fundamental level. But let's say, what would you do on Pakistan's end to sort of start course correcting?
So, let's talk about Turkey first, right? So in terms of scale, so they really need to find their market, right? Because the market is sort of dynamic because of how China has evolved, right? So the West, or the Americans and the Europeans, had like a tier of technology that they were exporting that was, high cost and, high effectiveness. And then China used to be this like lower rung of that ladder, like cheap and, high numbers of things, China and Russia, that you can, get. Russia is now really out of the picture at this point. But then China has progressed to a point where they're producing, many advanced things like, they're trying to export the J-35, for example. But the problem that, you get to hear is that they're not, excellent at, integrating into their customers' economy, A, and B, they're not great at aftermarket, service and support. So I think those are sort of opportunities for Turkey, right? Because A, they're trying to market into this, or they're trying to enter the same, segment of market that's already, populated by the West and now by China as well. So it is a difficult market. So like you said, the T-129 was an expensive helicopter, right? So these things without the scale that we want for Turkey are going to be expensive. So either they're going to need to be subsidized at some point, or they're going to have to work really hard to figure out what their USP is, right? Because eventually they're going to compete with China at least, right? So let's say like a country like Pakistan does not have access to the Western, like American F-16s or anything like that. But the TFX is directly going to compete with the J35. And so what can the TFX offer that the J35 cannot, right? And I would think, and I think this is their intention as well. Actually, I do know that this is their intention, is that they want like the local industry to get involved and have skin in the game for the TFX, right? So they don't just want to sell, let's say, 60 TFXs to about PF, right? They want that, and they want PAC to actually produce parts for the aircraft and be involved in that program. This is something you've brought up many times, that this de-risks the program for them and improves scale, right? And I'm pretty sure they're going to do the same thing with Indonesia.
And that's our preview for this episode of Pulse Check. To hear the full conversation and our complete analysis, subscribe to Quwa Plus at quwa.org/plus. Members get full access to every Pulse Check episode, plus our ongoing coverage of Pakistani defense procurement, strategic analysis, and deep dive reporting on Pakistan's defense modernization and policy. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.